Dangerously unqualified. That's what Dr. Mercer said 3 minutes before Rachel Torres walked into room 217 and found a man who'd been breathing but not living for 5 years. He didn't know that. He didn't know anything yet. But in 72 hours, everyone would know exactly who she was. And that knowledge would end careers. The fluorescent lights of Seattle General hummed their mechanical prayer as Rachel pushed through the 4th-floor corridor, her scrubs still carrying the chemical tang of industrial laundry. 6:56 a.m. 13 minutes before shift started. The long-term Coma ward smelled like antiseptic and resignation, that particular blend of bleach and expired hope that only exists in places where people go to be forgotten. She adjusted her badge 3 times in the elevator. Once at the neck. Once at the pocket. Once more, checking the photo like it might have changed since yesterday. The badge photo was real. Captain Rachel Torres, it said. Registered nurse, licensed in Washington State. All the credentials were genuine. The identity was the problem. Room 217 was at the end of the East Corridor, past the medication station where 2 nurses barely looked up from their computers, past the supply closet where the 4 pumps hummed like sleeping animals. The door was already open. She could see the bed before she reached it. Colonel Marcus Hale lay in the precise center of that bed the way hospital patients do after 5 years, perfectly positioned, skin tone the color of spent shell casings, hands folded across his chest like someone had arranged him for viewing and simply never rearranged him again. The ventilator wheezed its rhythmic mechanical prayer beside him. 3 lines ran into his left arm. A feeding tube disappeared behind his right ear. A Foley catheter connected to a bag of pale yellow urine that looked like it hadn't changed volume in hours. Every machine in the room was running. Every single one. Rachel stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The smell changed, sharper, more specific. Urine, antiseptic, and underneath it, something faintly organic. Human decay moving so slowly you could almost not notice it. Almost. She pulled his chart from the wall rack and started reading. Admission, 5 years, for months, 17 days ago. Cause, IED blast, Hindu Kush Mountains, Cuna Province. Initial Glasgow Coma scale on arrival, 6, current status, no change. No improvement. No deterioration. Perfect stasis. But the equipment. That was the part that caught her. 2 ventilators where one would do. 1 active, 1 backup positioned like a ceremonial guard. A level 1 rapid infuser mounted on the 4 stand, the kind of high-flow system used in trauma bays, not in the rooms of patients whose bleeding had stopped half a decade ago. An advanced hemodynamic monitoring system displaying blood pressure, heart rate, central venous pressure, data points no one was reading, flowing in real time to machines that looked like sculptures in a modern art museum. Expensive sculptures. She could see the billing codes dancing in her head. Equipment rental, $6,200 per week. Monitoring fees, $4,400 per week. Specialized staffing surcharge, $7,400 per week. The math was simple. Colonel Hale's room was generating $18,000 in weekly billing. Every single week. 52 weeks a year. 5 years. For $0.68 million, just in this room, billed to a military insurance contract with escalation clauses and inflated equipment charges built into every line. Rachel turned to look at the deployment jacket hanging in the closet, faded olive drab, the kind of jacket that had seen rain and dust and things that weren't weather. She walked over and ran her fingers along the lining. There. Stitched carefully into the interior seam. A patch. Worn almost transparent. A unit patch from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. She knew that unit. Knew the way they moved. Knew the sound their boots made on different surfaces. Knew exactly the kind of training that built soldiers like Colonel Hale. The patch was barely larger than her thumb. Faded green and black with a horse's head snarling. And underneath it, something felt deliberate about the way it had been sewn. Not casual. Not the work of a soldier's wife or mother mending equipment before deployment. This was careful. Hidden. Protected. Her fingers traced it for 2 seconds. 3. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor. The elevator doors opened at the far end of the ward. Rachel moved away from the closet, back to the bedside, just as the footsteps reached the door. She was checking the ventilator settings, respiratory rate, tidal volume, PEEP pressure, when Dr. Marcus Mercer walked in. He was tall in the way that height alone creates authority, even before the white coat. The kind of man who took up space and expected everyone else to compress. Mid-50s. Tailored shirt visible beneath the white coat. Watch that probably cost more than Rachel's apartment. He didn't look at the patient. He looked at Rachel. His eyes moved down from her face to her hands, then to her badge. Torres, he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a file being opened. Temp assignment. First day, Rachel said. Her voice came out exactly as it should, deferential, careful, the voice of someone who had been told multiple times that she was in over her head. Just reviewing the chart and vitals. She adjusted her badge. An unconscious gesture. The third time in 6 minutes. Mercer noticed. His mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. The procedures in this room are complex. The patient's condition is extremely delicate. I don't tolerate improvisation or deviation from established protocols. Yes, sir. I understand. Do you? He moved to the monitor and reviewed the readings with the attention of someone checking his stock portfolio. Not the attention of someone checking on a patient. Colonel Hale requires maximum monitoring, maximum support, maximum care. He's a military hero who deserves our absolute best. Everything in this room stays exactly as it is. Any questions? Rachel met his eyes briefly. No, sir. Good. Rounds are at 0700. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Stay out of the way, Torres. You're a temp. This ward has been running perfectly fine before you arrived, and it will continue to run perfectly fine after you leave. The door closed behind him. The ventilator wheezed. The heart monitor beeped its steady electronic prayer, 67 beats per minute, regular as a metronome, unchanged from 5 years ago when that IED took everything else. Rachel waited for the footsteps to fade down the corridor. 30 seconds. 45. Then she heard the elevator doors open again, heard Mercer's voice in the hallway, clipped, territorial, explaining something to someone in a voice designed to intimidate. The problem with temps, she heard him say, is they don't understand the stakes. She was repositioning the colonels for line when the doorway darkened again. Not Mercer this time. Someone else. An older man in scrubs, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of posture that comes from years of standing in operating rooms. His name tag said Clayton, VA transfer, combat medic. He stood in the doorway and watched her work. Rachel didn't acknowledge him immediately. She focused on the line, a 20-gauge angiocath positioned in the colonel's left antecubital vein, taped carefully but not optimally. The tape was placed longitudinally instead of crossed. It would fail within 48 hours. She knew this because she had placed thousands of 4 lines. She knew this because her hands remembered work that her mind was not supposed to remember. She repositioned the tape using a diagonal cross pattern, left to right across the site, then right to left, creating a secure pocket that would hold through the week. The movement was fluid. Automatic. The kind of automatic that comes from doing something 500 times, not 5 times. You've done that before, Clayton said. It wasn't a question. Rachel didn't turn around. She pressed a new piece of tape to secure the line. Nursing school. They really drill the fundamentals. That's not nursing school. Clayton stepped into the room. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight, the kind of quiet that comes from a man who has given orders and been obeyed. That's field work. That's the diagonal entry angle they taught us in Kandahar at the forward surgical teams. That's the kind of positioning you do when you don't have 4 hours for infiltration in a combat hospital. Rachel's hands didn't tremble. Her jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but her hands didn't tremble. She finished securing the tape and turned to face him. "New nurse," she said. "Lots to learn." Clayton studied her for a long moment. His eyes tracked from her hands to her wrists, where rope burns had faded to thin white lines barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for, and back to her face. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm sure." He left the room without another word, but his eyes were different. His eyes had recognized something. His eyes had seen through the temp assignment and the nervous badge adjustments and the careful, deferential voice. His eyes had seen through the mask. Rachel sat beside the colonel's bed and pulled up his monitoring dashboard on the wall display. 5 years of data, charted and graphed and analyzed, showing absolutely nothing. No change in brain activity. No response to pain stimuli. No indication that anything inside that head was still running. Just a body, maintained with exquisite precision, generating $18,000 per week in billing to a military insurance contract that had been structured with almost artistic care. The ventilator wheezed. The monitor beeped. Rain began to hammer against the window, sudden, unexpected, the kind of weather that comes from nowhere in the early morning when most people are still asleep. She didn't know yet that by this afternoon she would walk into morning rounds and make a suggestion that would crack everything wide open. She didn't know that Dr. Mercer would respond in front of Colonel Hale's visiting sister, in front of 2 other nurses, in front of the entire unit. She didn't know that Clayton would be watching from the corner, his eyes narrowing further, his memory pulling up files he thought were closed. She just sat there, in the early morning, beside a man she had been sent to find, and wondered what he had been carrying when that IED went off. Wondered what was hidden in that faded unit patch, stitched so carefully into the jacket's lining that it could survive explosions and hospital stays and 5 years of institutional forgetting. Behind her, in the closet, the deployment jacket hung in the fluorescent half-light. And in the hallway, footsteps were moving. Mercer was on his way back. The shift was about to begin. And Rachel Torres was still adjusting to how it felt to be someone else, even if everyone around her was starting to sense that the person they were looking at wasn't quite the temp nurse her badge claimed to be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was running out of time. Morning rounds at Seattle General moved like clockwork, 6:11 a.m., the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical prayer, the ventilators keeping tempo like a chorus of mechanical lungs. Rachel pushed the med cart down the corridor, her scrubs still crisp, her movements careful, trying to occupy the space where confidence should have been. She'd watched Mercer work for less than 24 hours, but she'd watched enough. She'd seen the billing codes. She'd counted the machines. And she'd learned long ago that some silences were louder than gunshots. Dr. Mercer stood at the nurse's station reviewing Colonel Hale's chart, his pen poised over a signature line like it was a weapon he'd mastered years ago. Rachel approached quietly, her voice neutral, deferential, the voice of someone who knew her place. "Doctor, on your review of the Colonel's protocol. The telemetry monitoring, the hourly neuro checks, and the supplemental oxygen calibration. His baseline's been stable for 72 hours. 3 procedures seem." She paused, choosing the word like it was a grenade she was diffusing. "Redundant." Mercer's pen stopped. The silence that followed didn't feel empty, it felt occupied by something vast and angry. He turned to face her fully, and his voice carried down the hallway like thunder rolling across a valley. "I'm sorry. Did the temp nurse just question my treatment protocol?" His eyes moved across her scrubs, cataloging her insufficiency. Colonel Hale's sister, visiting from Virginia for the week, stopped mid-step in the doorway. She was holding a thermos of coffee and wore the patient expression of someone accustomed to waiting for things that never changed. Mercer stepped closer. His voice dropped, which somehow made it worse. "You've been here what, 6 hours? And you think you understand complex neurological care better than a physician with 15 years of critical care experience?" The words came slow and precise, each one calibrated to land exactly where it would cut deepest. Your job is to check vitals and change bedding. Not to rewrite my treatment plans based on. He glanced at her name badge, whatever credentials you picked up at a community college. The room held its breath. 2 orderlies pretending to inventory linens. A respiratory therapist suddenly very interested in checking the ventilator in room 219. Rachel felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure, not sympathy, not yet, but awareness. The kind of awareness that came before judgment. Rachel took one measured breath. She didn't look away from Mercer's face. She didn't tremble. Her hands didn't move to her pockets or cross her chest in a defensive posture. Instead, she met his eyes with the kind of calm that only came from having already survived worse. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from fear, not from hurt, but from something harder to name. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. I've seen men die because someone prioritized billing over care. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational. I won't watch it happen in peacetime. Mercer's face flushed crimson. The silence that followed was the kind of silence where you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing like angry insects trapped in plastic casings. His jaw clenched. This is exactly the kind of dangerous, unqualified overreach that gets patients killed. And this is exactly why we have protocols. Exactly why temp staff stay in their lanes. He pivoted away from her, his white coat moving like a sail catching wind, and walked directly to the unit board in the main corridor. Rachel watched from where she stood, unnaturally still. Mercer pulled out a printed write-up. He'd already had it prepared, she realized. He'd been ready. He'd been waiting for her to give him the reason. The words were visible from 10 feet away, insubordination and overreach beyond scope of practice. Patient safety concern. His signature at the bottom was the signature of a man who just scored a point, and everyone watching would know it. The board was positioned where every staff member would see it. Incoming shifts. Outgoing shifts. Everyone who passed through those doors. Rachel finished her med cart inventory and moved toward the break room at 9:14 a.m. She needed coffee, the kind that tasted like something other than the metallic fear that had been coating her mouth since Mercer walked away. The break room was small, institutional, with a refrigerator that hummed too loudly and a microwave that never quite worked. 3 nurses were sitting at the corner table when she entered: Jennifer Chen, Marcus Williams, and someone named Patricia who worked nights and was crashing before her shift. All 3 had smiled at her during morning shift change. All 3 had welcomed her, offered directions, asked where she was from. Jennifer had told her about a decent coffee place on Capitol Boulevard. Marcus had warned her that the vending machine in the basement took quarters but only gave out pretzels. Rachel sat down at the opposite end of the table with her coffee. The silence didn't come immediately, that would have been too obvious. Instead, Jennifer suddenly remembered an urgent charting task. Marcus mentioned something about a patient in room 211 who needed attention. Patricia stood up without explanation, her eyes fixed on something in the middle distance, and walked out carrying her half-full cup of coffee. Jennifer glanced back, and for one moment Rachel saw actual sympathy cross her face, the kind of sympathy that came with a side order of fear. Jennifer was calculating the cost of friendship with someone Dr. Mercer had just marked as dangerous. Jennifer was doing the math. And Jennifer was finding the answer wanting. The break room emptied. Rachel sat alone under the flickering fluorescent light, the silence pressing against her ears like water at depth. The abandoned coffee cups remained on the table, small monuments to cowardice, still steaming slightly, the lipstick marks on the rims looking almost accusatory. She didn't flinch. She didn't look around to confirm she was alone. She simply sat and drank her coffee and thought about the colonel in room 217, and about men she'd known who died because someone was billing by the procedure instead of healing by the outcome. Through the break room window, Morrison watched. The VA transfer nurse, his name tag read E.J. Morrison, his uniform bore the faded patches of someone who'd spent decades in places that didn't appear on most maps. Kandahar. Jalabad. The Hindu Kush where the rocks looked like broken teeth and the wind smelled like diesel and dust. Morrison had been watching Rachel since she'd arrived yesterday. More than watching. Recognizing. His jaw tightened as he saw the abandoned coffee cups. His weathered face darkened with something that looked like anger, but underneath it was something else. Underneath it was professional assessment. Someone calculating the same things Rachel was calculating, but arriving at different conclusions. That evening, Rachel moved through the halls of Seattle General like a ghost that had learned to pass through walls quietly. The write-up on the unit board seemed to carry weight. She could feel staff members accounting for her differently now. A necessary person, but a dangerous one. The kind of person you smiled at from a distance but didn't stand next to. She stopped by Colonel Hale's room at 11:14 p.m. during her final rounds. The room was dim, lit only by the soft green glow of monitoring equipment and the pale light from the hallway filtering through the door's narrow window. She ran her hand along his full line, checked the ventilator settings, confirmed the oxygen saturation holding steady at 94%. His respiratory rate was 12, calm, mechanically perfect. His temperature was 98.1. His heart rhythm was a steady sinus beat, the kind of rhythm that came from a body doing nothing but breathing and waiting. But something felt different. She'd learned to read the language of machines long before she'd learned English, back in field hospitals where equipment failure meant body bags. The colonel's breathing sounded slightly labored, just slightly, the kind of slight that made her pause. His oxygen saturation was holding at 94, but it had been 96 just 6 hours ago. 2 points wasn't nothing. 2 points could become 4. 4 could become 10. She increased his oxygen flow from 2 liters to 3. She documented it, noting the subtle change in her careful handwriting. Then she returned to the main station and tried to convince herself it was nothing. Probably nothing. Definitely nothing. At 11:24 p.m., she checked on him again. His temperature had spiked. 99.8, 100.1. 102.2, rising like a thermometer dropped into hot water. His breathing had changed, more rapid now, shallower, the mechanical sound of distress bleeding through the ventilator's hiss. She paged the on-call doctor immediately and went back to the colonel's room to wait. That was when everything changed. His heart rate dropped. Not rose, dropped. Heart rate of 52. Then 48. Then 42. His blood pressure fell like a stone down a well. And his breathing stopped matching the ventilator's rhythm. His trachea appeared deviated to the left, pushed sideways by something building pressure inside his chest. His jugular veins distended like they were trying to escape. No breath sounds on the right side. Nothing. Silence where there should have been air moving, and silence was always worse than noise. Tension pneumothorax. A lung had collapsed. Air was filling the space between the lung and the chest wall, compressing his heart, choking off return flow. In the civilian world, this would call for a surgical intervention. In the field, in the mountains of Kandahar, in forward surgical teams set up in buildings that smelled like diesel and death, this was a needle. One needle, one moment, life or death. The code alarm screamed through the ward like a predator that had finally found prey. Code blue. Code blue in room 217. Rachel moved without thinking, which meant she moved the way her hands had been trained to move, the way her nervous system had been taught in a place and time she wasn't supposed to remember. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She counted ribs on the colonel's right side, found the second intercostal space, felt for the midclavicular line. The insertion angle was diagonal, not the perpendicular approach that appeared in civilian textbooks, but the angle they'd taught to special operations medics in forward surgical teams at FOB Shank in Loga Province. Different approach. Same outcome. Life. The needle went in. There was the hiss, that beautiful, terrible hiss of trapped air escaping, pressure equalizing, physics reasserting itself. The colonel's oxygen saturation began climbing. 68, 72. 78, 85. His heart rate came up. His blood pressure stabilized. His trachea straightened. Breathing resumed its mechanical rhythm. By the time the code team arrived, running hard, their shoes slapping against the tile in a staccato rhythm that sounded like gunfire, the colonel was breathing. Stable. Recovering. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway 4 minutes later, still in street clothes, no white coat, clearly called in from home. His eyes moved across the room, cataloguing the scene. The needle decompression kit. The 4 lines. Rachel's steady hands charting the intervention in the medical record. His expression hardened into something that looked less like concern and more like calculation. Through the supply closet window, Morrison watched. The old VA transfer nurse stood in the shadows near the supply shelves, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Rachel's hands. On the angle. On the technique. On the kind of medical knowledge that didn't come from any nursing school in North America. Recognition dawned across his weathered face like sunrise breaking across a desert, slow, inevitable, and absolutely certain. He'd seen hands move like that before. He'd seen people trained in places where textbooks didn't matter because textbooks couldn't account for the speed of bleeding or the scarcity of resources or the weight of keeping someone alive when the only thing you had was muscle memory and will. He knew exactly what he was looking at. And he said nothing. The fever came at 2:56 a.m. Rachel noticed it first, the slight elevation in the colonel's temperature readout, climbing from 98.2 to 99.1 to 99.8 in steady increments. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that would trigger alarms yet. But wrong. Her hands recognized wrong the way a musician recognizes a missed note in a symphony. She adjusted the cooling blanket, documented the change, and watched the monitor with the particular attention that comes from knowing a man's body for 5 weeks straight. By 3:15, his temperature hit 101.4. She called the nursing station. The night shift answered with the flat effect of exhaustion, a woman named Chen who'd been pulling doubles all week. "I'll note it. Fever protocol says watch and wait until 102. Rachel didn't argue. She already had the termination letter sitting in her locker. Arguing now would only accelerate what was already in motion. So she watched. She documented. She kept her observations to herself while the colonel's skin went hot to the touch and his breathing pattern shifted, becoming shallower, faster, like a runner accelerating before the bell. At 3:43, his oxygen saturation dropped to 92. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. A third time. The rhythm was still sinus, still organized, but his body was working now. Working hard. Fighting something inside his chest that nobody could see on an ultrasound or CT scan. Rachel's eyes moved across the ventilator settings, the 4 drip rates, the chest tube placement from 4 days ago. Everything was patent. Everything was functioning. But something had shifted. Something deep in the colonel's physiology had turned a corner and started running the opposite direction. She pressed the call button. Chen answered with a sigh that traveled through the speaker. Yes? O2 sat dropping. 92 and falling. Temperature 101.8. I'll get the resident. Chen's tone suggested this was optional. It took 40 seconds. Then 40 more. Rachel watched the sat drop to 90. Then 88. The ventilator began delivering more aggressive breaths, compensating automatically, but the problem wasn't the machine. The problem was the colonel's chest. Something was building pressure inside that thoracic cavity, crushing the lung, compromising venous return, suffocating the heart. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis came to her with the clarity of muscle memory. Not conscious deduction. Not a thought process. Her hands already knew what her conscious mind was still assembling. The signs were all there, asymmetrical breath sounds, hypertension creeping in at the lower edge of the monitor, tracheal deviation that she could feel with her fingertips against his neck. The chest tube wasn't working. It had kinked or clotted or migrated. And the colonel's second lung was collapsing inward like a building imploding. The resident, a third-year named Dr. Patel who couldn't have been more than 28, arrived in scrubs that still had yesterday's coffee stain on the pocket. His eyes were foggy with sleep.
What are we looking at?
Tension pneumo. He needs a needle decompression. Patel looked at the vitals. His face went through the calculation process, the one where civilian doctors try to remember their ATLS protocols from a textbook they'd crammed 5 years ago. He pulled out his phone.
I need to call Mercer.
This is above my... No time. Rachel was already moving. She'd already grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the emergency crash cart. She'd already located the precise anatomical landmark, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, where the needle would glide through skin and muscle and pleura and release the pressure that was crushing the colonel's heart like a fist closing around wet sand. Patel's voice rose. You can't, you're not authorized. She wasn't listening anymore. The hospital, the paperwork, the reprimand, the termination letter that was already typed and waiting, it all fell away. There was only the colonel's chest, the pressure building inside it, and the 7-year-old memory of a compound in Cuna province where she'd performed this exact procedure on a ranger lieutenant whose lung had collapsed after an RPG fragmented through his ribs, and she'd pushed a needle through his chest cavity in a firefight while Taliban rounds kicked up dust around her boots. The hiss of air escaping. That was the sound that meant it was working. That small, definitive whistle of pressure releasing. The colonel's chest expanded. His oxygen saturation jumped, 92, 94, 96, climbing like he was coming back from underwater. His blood pressure stabilized. The monitor that had been screaming with chaos settled into a steady, organized rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Strong. Stable. Alive. Get me a chest tube kit, Rachel said quietly. Her voice had changed. The deferential temp nurse was gone. In her place was someone else, someone who'd spent 7 years operating in spaces where hesitation meant body bags. We need to establish proper pleural drainage before the pressure rebuilds. Patel stared at her. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled onto dry land. Now, doctor. He moved. By 4:12, she'd placed a 32 French tube using the Seldinger technique, and the colonel's blood pressure had climbed from 68/42 to 94/58. His breathing had synchronized with the ventilator. The fever had broken, actually broken, the temperature dropping from 101.8 back to 100.1 as his body abandoned the fight-or-flight cascade. Rachel secured the tube with sutures, checked the placement one more time, and stepped back. The colonel was stable. Stable and breathing and alive in a way that hadn't been true 43 minutes ago. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the overhead paging system crackled to life with Dr. Mercer's voice, all code team personnel to room 217. All code team personnel to room 217. He arrived before the full team did. Emerged from the stairwell in a bathrobe over his pajamas, his hair uncombed, his face carrying the particular fury of a man who'd been woken up at 4:18 in the morning. His eyes took in the colonel, stable, breathing, alive. Then his eyes found Rachel. Then they found the needle kit on the bedside table. What did you do? Tension pneumothorax secondary to kinked chest tube. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, with 14-gauge angiocath. Subsequent Seldinger technique tube placement, 32 French. Rachel's voice was flat. Clinical. A surgeon reporting findings to a colleague, not a temp nurse explaining herself to an attending physician. Patient is stable. Mercer's jaw clenched. Not the expression of a man processing medical information. The expression of a man watching his carefully constructed billing structure get dismantled in real time. The colonel wasn't supposed to improve. The colonel was supposed to remain permanently dependent on maximum level interventions, each one billable at premium rates. The colonel was a revenue stream that required him to stay exactly at the edge of alive, not dead enough to stop billing, not alive enough to leave. You performed an invasive procedure without attending supervision. You're not credentialed for thoracic interventions. Mercer's voice was rising. The code team was arriving now, 3 nurses and a surgical intern and a respiratory specialist, all of them filing in and seeing what Mercer saw, a patient who'd been in cardiac arrest 45 minutes ago now breathing steadily with a newly placed chest tube and vital signs that had improved dramatically in the last 20 minutes. The patient needed intervention, Rachel said quietly. The patient received intervention. The patient is stable. Mercer's phone was already in his hand. She watched him step into the hallway and start dialing. She heard fragments of his voice, urgent whispers about liability and unauthorized procedures and temp staff and scope of practice. She heard him say her name 3 times and each time his tone made it sound like a curse. By 4:13 a.m., Nurse Morrison was standing in the doorway. He looked at the colonel's chest, at the new tube, at Rachel's hands that had stopped trembling because they'd never started. He looked at her face and nodded once, a small acknowledgement that passed between people who'd seen the same impossible things happen in the dark. "I need to check the tube placement," he said to the room. He didn't look at Rachel as he said it. But his eyes held hers for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds she understood that he knew. He knew what those 7-year-old hands had learned in a place where the nearest surgeon was a Black Hawk flight away. He knew what that needle angle meant. He knew everything. She needed Jell-O, actually. Needed coffee. Needed about 6 hours of sleep that she wouldn't be getting. But what she did was nod to Morrison, document one final set of vitals, and walk toward the break room with her shoulders steady and her breathing controlled and absolutely no tremor in her hands. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects. The hallway smelled like bleach and body fluids and the particular exhaustion that comes from hours of adrenaline burning through your system. Somewhere on the unit, a phone rang. Somewhere else, a patient's family member was crying quietly in a waiting room chair, the way they did at 4:50 a.m. when the world was darkest. Rachel poured coffee that had been sitting in the pot since 11 p.m. It tasted like burnt copper and regret. Her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number, report to director's office 0600. She looked at the message for 8 seconds. Then she set the phone face down on the break room table and sat very still, watching the coffee steam rise and disappear into nothing, understanding with absolute clarity that everything was about to change. Midnight came and went without fanfare. Rachel sat in her car in the Seattle General parking lot, watching the entrance lights blur through rain-streaked windows, listening to her phone ring for the 7th time. Her handler wasn't answering. The voicemail on the secure line remained unchanged, "Leave a message." She left 7 messages. 7 dead ends. By 12:19 a.m., Dr. Mercer was making calls. The nursing director answered on the 3rd ring, her voice hoarse with sleep. Mercer's words came rapid and clipped, "I need to report an incident involving unauthorized medical procedures by uncredentialed staff operating beyond scope of practice." The director sat up in bed. Mercer continued, his voice the practiced concern of a man protecting the institution. The temp nurse assigned to Colonel Hale's room performed a needle decompression without physician supervision. That's an invasive procedure. That's scope violation. We need it documented immediately. The nursing director's name was Susan Marks, and she'd been in healthcare administration for 19 years. She knew the difference between competence and protocol violation. But she also knew the liability spreadsheet. "I'll need an incident report," she said carefully. By morning. By the time the sun broke over Raleigh, pale and thin, struggling through clouds, Rachel's badge had been deactivated. The security office called it a precautionary measure pending investigation. The schedule board had been updated overnight, Rachel's name removed from every shift for the next 2 weeks. A manila envelope with her formal termination papers awaited her in the staffing office, stamped with Mercer's signature and the date, still wet. She stood in the hallway at 6:43 a.m., holding the envelope like it weighed 50 pounds. A letter from the nursing board cited insubordination, operating beyond credentialed scope, and endangering patient safety through unauthorized intervention. Someone had attached photographs of the incident report, the one Mercer filed at 1:15 a.m. The timeline was impeccable. The language was surgical. The conclusion was inevitable. Pending investigation, all temp staff access to Colonel Marcus Hale's room was revoked, effective immediately. Rachel didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply set the envelope on the break room table and walked to the parking garage, her movements precise and controlled, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. But her hands, steady as surgical steel when holding a needle, trembled slightly as she gripped the car door. What she didn't see was Morrison being pulled from the schedule that same morning. Dr. Mercer had handled that conversation personally, speaking quietly in the hallway outside Morrison's locker. "I'm reassigning you to the cardiac ward, effective today. We need you on a different floor." Morrison had opened his mouth to ask why. Mercer didn't wait for the question. "It's a transfer. Non-negotiable." Then he was gone, leaving Morrison standing in the hallway with the knowledge that his recognition of Rachel's skill, the thing that had made him proud, the moment he'd felt like he'd actually seen something true, was now being erased. Mercer's last move was the simplest one. He sent an email to the staffing director, "All temporary nursing assignments to Colonel Hale's room are suspended pending investigation. No exceptions. Nursing director approval required for any future contact." The email was copied to hospital security, the charge nurse, and the medical director. It was airtight. No temp would touch that room now. No one would have access to observe. No one would see what happened next in that carefully managed space. Rachel understood the architecture of what had been built around her. She understood, with the clarity that came from 12 years of military intelligence work, that she'd been isolated, documented, and neutralized. The procedure she'd performed was being reclassified as insubordination. The emergency that had just kept Colonel Hale alive was being filed as an authorized scope violation. And the one person who'd recognized her, Morrison, had been removed from the equation entirely. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 37 minutes, engine off, rain drumming the roof like Morse code. Her phone sat on the passenger seat. Her deactivated badge sat beside it. And underneath both was the mission briefing she'd memorized 2 months ago: locate Captain Rachel Torres, embedded in Seattle General, monitoring Colonel Marcus Hale, classified military witness, potential defector risk, intelligence value, Category 1. She couldn't fight this without revealing exactly who she was. And she couldn't reveal who she was without ending the operation. The choice had been made for her. The only question remaining was whether Mercer had moved fast enough to bury the real reason the Colonel's room had just been emptied, or whether he'd simply guaranteed that no one inside this hospital would ever see what he was really protecting. Rachel started the engine and drove. Capitol Boulevard ran north through Raleigh like an old scar. The diner was called Mel's, the kind of place that had been serving coffee at 3 in the morning for 42 years without changing the lighting or the vinyl booths. Rachel sat in a corner booth, her coffee gone cold at least an hour ago, the liquid the color of old pennies. Through the window behind her, the darkness outside was absolute. No street lights illuminated Capitol Boulevard at 3:17 a.m. No cars passed. The world had contracted to this one fluorescent box and the rain hammering the glass like it had a personal vendetta. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back wasn't wearing scrubs anymore. She was wearing jeans and a grey sweater, unremarkable as smoke. Her hair was down, not the practical bun she'd maintained during shifts. Her hands were folded on the table, and even in the dim light, she could see the creases from the latex gloves, the faint discoloration on her knuckles where the bleach had dried. That was the job, right there. Not the rank. Not the training. Just hands that had held people together in the worst moments, hands that had been trusted, and hands that had now been deemed dangerous. The reflection didn't look defeated. It looked like something that had learned, long ago, not to feel defeat. That was worse. That was the real problem. Her phone had stopped ringing at 2:41 a.m. Her handler still wasn't responding. There would be protocols for this: dead drop locations, secondary contact numbers, procedures for compromised operations. But those protocols were designed for active field agents, agents with access, agents who could still move. They weren't designed for agents who'd been neutralized by a doctor protecting his quarterly billing numbers. She'd spent the last hour reviewing what she'd lose. Access to Colonel Hale's room meant no access to the unit patch hidden in his jacket, the one that had been carefully stitched into the deployment jacket lining by someone who knew he might not make it home. The intelligence on that patch, the classified coordinates, the names of contacts, the location of the documents he'd hidden before the IED took his consciousness, that was sitting in a closet at Seattle General, 15 stories up, locked in a room with security restrictions that now applied to her. She'd had 5 years to extract that intelligence. She'd been in the hospital for 3 months. And she'd used all 3 of those months to prove her competence, to establish herself, to earn the kind of trust that would let her access the patient files, the room, the jacket. And then in one moment, the moment she actually saved the patient's life, she'd blown the entire operation open. The coffee shop's radio played something instrumental and forgettable. The cook, visible through the kitchen window, was reading a newspaper, not looking up. The waitress who'd poured Rachel's coffee 3 hours ago had stopped offering refills an hour in. Rachel was the kind of customer they'd learned to ignore, someone who was clearly running from something and wouldn't want company. She pulled her hands apart and laid them flat on the table. Steady. Not trembling. Not reflecting anything but years of training in keeping still when the world was falling apart. Somewhere above Raleigh, in the darkness over the Indian Ocean, in tents and forward operating bases and safe houses across 3 continents, people were asking the same question: where was Switchback? Where was the asset placed at Seattle General? Why had the signal gone dark? She didn't know the answer. She only knew that if she walked back into that hospital, she'd be arrested for impersonation and fraud. She only knew that Colonel Hale was lying in a room that was locked to her now, with a jacket in a closet that contained intelligence that would take 3 years to decode if it fell into the wrong hands. She only knew that Mercer had moved faster than she'd expected, which meant someone had told him to move. The rain kept falling. The window kept reflecting her face. And at 3:17 a.m. on Capitol Boulevard, alone in a fluorescent box with cold coffee and the knowledge that she'd failed to protect the mission, Rachel Torres understood something clearer than she'd understood anything in 12 years of service. The most dangerous enemy wasn't always the one who saw you coming. Sometimes it was the one who saw you doing something good and decided it was still a threat worth eliminating. The hallway went quiet at 11:08 a.m. when the federal transport arrived. 2 corrections officers in dark uniforms escorted a detainee in restraints from the intake wing, a Taliban commander named Rashid Ahmadi, transferred from a federal detention center for pre-extradition medical clearance. The escort papers said he had a perforated ulcer that needed monitoring before the flight to Guantanamo. What the papers didn't mention was that he'd been a target for 3 Army intelligence operations, and that 2 of those operations had ended with Americans walking out alive when they should have died in the snow. Rachel was pushing a med cart down the east corridor when the transport passed. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The guards moved with the precise spacing of federal protocol, and the detainee's hands were zip-tied to a waist chain. Standard custody procedure. Standard until the moment the detainee's eyes found her face over the shoulder of the officer in front of him. He went rigid. The guards felt it instantly, the sudden tension in his body, the shift in his weight, the way his breathing changed from steady to controlled explosive. One officer's hand moved to his radio. The detainee's lips moved. 3 words came out like a curse and a prayer at the same time: Shida. It's her. Shida. Rachel kept walking. 30 feet. 40 feet. But the intake nurse had already stopped moving. The detainee's eyes stayed locked on her back as the guards accelerated his movement toward the secure medical ward, confused, speaking into their radios about elevated vital signs, possible agitation, request for psych eval. Shida. The name meant shadow in Dari. It was the call sign whispered through the Hindu Kush 5 years ago, passed between fighters like a warning. An American medic had walked into a Taliban compound alone during a negotiation gone wrong. 2 hostages, a wounded Marine and an interpreter. She'd carried them out. Both alive. No gunfire. No casualties. Just gone. The story became legend because nobody believed it could happen. The Marine Guard noticed her hands. They were shaking. Not from fear. From recognition. From the fact that the past had just spoken her name in a hospital corridor in Raleigh, North Carolina, and that there were only 3 people alive who knew what that word meant. He was stationed 2 floors down, accompanying a wounded veteran from the VA liaison program. 32 years old, sharp eyes, the bearing of someone who'd seen ops go sideways and understood the weight of people doing impossible things in impossible places. He watched Rachel continue toward the medication room and made a decision that would end Dr. Mercer's career in the next 6 hours. He found her in the supply closet restocking saline bags. Captain Torres. That's the name on your employee badge, right? Just want to confirm. Rachel's movements didn't change. She set the bag on the shelf, turned slowly, and met his eyes. The Marine understood immediately what he was looking at, a person whose composure was the sound of an avalanche held back by a single rope. Yes. My name is Holloway. I was 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines. Jojjan Province, 2019. He pulled her personnel file from under his arm. I've been reading your actual credentials. The ones in the system. Not the fake ones they've been running. He held the jacket open. Want to know what I found? Rachel's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Holloway began reading aloud, his voice steady and clear enough for the other nurses in the nearby corridor to hear. Captain Rachel Torres. Army Intelligence. Active duty status, currently unassigned. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. Let that settle into the air like a challenge. Purple Heart. Another pause. 2nd Purple Heart. He turned the page. Army Commendation Medal for extracting wounded under fire in Coma Province. He looked up from the paper. That's you, right? Rachel nodded once. The moment stretched thin as wire. Holloway was still reading when footsteps became urgent, fast walking pace, then running steps. Dr. Mercer shoved through the group of nurses gathering in the corridor, his face the color of burned ashes. That's classified information. She's been terminated. This is hospital disruption, and we need to clear this corridor now. He reached for the file, but Holloway didn't move. The Marine was built like a vault door. I'm not finished, Holloway said. His voice had changed. The courtesy was gone. What remained was pure command authority. She also received an Army Commendation Medal for actions in Coma Province. That's the province where the extraction happened. He turned the next page. And she's been carrying a military patch sewn into. That's a personnel file. You have no clearance to be reading. Mercer's voice climbed higher with each word, cracking like ice under pressure. His hands were curling into fists. The elevator opened at the far end of the corridor. A 3-star general stepped out. General Marcus Garrett, Vietnam veteran, 73 years old, visiting the VA wing as part of his monthly oversight of military medical standards. He wore dress blues. His chest was a geography of metals, 2 stars that meant he'd commanded thousands of soldiers, a Distinguished Service Medal, a silver star from a war that had been over for 40 years. He'd been walking the ward, reviewing patient care protocols, when the commotion pulled him this direction. He saw the Marine still holding the file. He saw Dr. Mercer's red face. He saw Rachel Torres standing absolutely motionless in the supply closet doorway, her eyes straight ahead, her breathing controlled to 5 counts in and 5 counts out. Then he saw the medals listed on the page the Marine was holding. General Garrett stepped into the silence. He didn't speak. He looked at Rachel's face, then at the Bronze Star notation, then back at her face. A slow recognition moved across his features, the kind that happens when you understand you're looking at someone you misjudged. He raised his right hand and offered her a full, slow salute. Every nurse in the corridor froze. The salute held for 3 seconds. General Garrett lowered his hand and turned to Mercer. You've been denying this officer access to a patient under federal intelligence interest. That's a federal violation, Dr. Mercer. and I want a complete explanation. But Mercer was already moving. He excused himself with words that nobody heard, claiming he needed to verify credentials in his office, but what he actually did was rush to the administrative wing on the 4th floor, log into the personnel database using his physician override code, and attempt to do something that would destroy what remained of his freedom. He searched for Rachel's original employment file. He accessed her credentials section. His hands shook as he typed, changing her license number, modifying the verification date, adding notes claiming pending state board investigation. He was creating a paper trail that would prove she'd falsified her entire nursing license. He was creating reasonable doubt. He was creating deniability. He didn't know that the FBI's cyber division monitors all personnel database access at facilities treating federal detainees. He didn't know that his override code triggered 3 automated alerts. He didn't know that federal agents were dispatched from the Raleigh field office within 12 minutes of his intrusion. Downstairs, in the hallway where Holloway still stood with the file, General Garrett looked directly at Rachel. "What was your mission here, Captain?" Rachel's voice came out measured, quiet, carrying the weight of 5 years of silence. Colonel Hale disappeared for 21 days in the Hindu Kush before the IED blast that sent him stateside. Army intelligence believes he discovered evidence of a compromised operation, friendly fire coordinates being sold to Taliban forces. She paused. The intelligence is encoded in the stitching pattern of his unit patch. It's in his room. A patch I've been locked out of accessing. General Garrett turned immediately to the hospital administrator, who had appeared at the end of the corridor, ashen-faced. "Restore Captain Torres's access to Colonel Hale's room immediately. And I want a complete audit of his billing records from the past 5 years." The administrator nodded, speaking into his radio, his voice climbing with urgency. Dr. Mercer returned 11 minutes later, trying to appear confident, trying to carry off the lie. He stopped in front of General Garrett. "I've just reviewed her files," he said, his voice forced casual. "Her credentials don't check out. This entire situation is a misunderstanding, but—" The elevator opened. 2 FBI agents stepped out wearing dark suits and the expression of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. One of them was a woman named Agent Chen, 38, 15 years in counterintelligence. The other was a man named Agent Willis, who'd spent 6 years tracking cybercrime. They walked toward the group. "Dr. Nathan Mercer." Agent Chen's voice was sharp as a scalpel. Mercer turned. He understood, in the space of 1 second, that his life had just become something he could no longer control. "I am. You're under arrest for unauthorized access to a federal personnel database and attempted falsification of federal employment records." Agent Willis was already moving, his hands reaching for the cuffs on his belt. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words came in rhythm, the rhythm Mercer had heard only on television, the rhythm that meant endings. Agent Chen read the rest of his Miranda rights while her partner handcuffed his wrists. The metal closed with the sound of a lock clicking shut. The staff watched in stunned silence. Nurse Morrison whispered something to Jennifer, who whispered it back. He tried to cover it up. He actually tried to cover it up. As the agents walked Dr. Mercer toward the elevator, his face was the face of a man understanding that his fraud had been small enough to ignore for 5 years, but the desperation it created was large enough to end everything in 30 minutes. He passed Rachel. She met his eyes. Her expression was unchanged, quiet, measured, dignified. She said nothing. The silence between them lasted longer than any sentence could have. The elevator doors closed on his face. General Garrett turned to Rachel. "The patch is yours, Captain. Finish your mission." 1 year later, Rachel sat beside Colonel Marcus Hale's bed at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where he'd been transferred under proper specialized care without a single fraudulent billing charge. The room was quieter here, afternoon sunlight coming through the window instead of the fluorescent hum of the long-term ward. The walls were pale blue. A flag hung in the corner. She held the faded unit patch in her hands. The coordinates had been decoded, The analysis had taken 3 months. The intelligence had led to the arrest of a defense contractor named Keegan Mills who'd been selling targeting data to Taliban forces for $47,000 per transaction. Justice, slowly. The patch was evidence now, preserved in a federal locker, but Rachel had been given a photograph of it. Dr. Mercer's medical license was revoked. The fraud investigation uncovered $2.4 million in inflated billing across 18 long-term coma patients. Last Rachel heard, he was teaching CPR classes at a community college for $15 an hour, living in a studio apartment near the airport, his career reduced to showing people how to push on the chests of the dying for 90 minutes every Tuesday and Thursday. She leaned close to Colonel Hale and whispered the mission details, how his discovery stopped the leak, how his sacrifice mattered, how 6 soldiers were alive because of what he found in those mountains. She believed some soldiers just needed to hear a voice that understood what they left behind. Nurse Morrison, now working the VA liaison program at Walter Reed, stopped by her station. "You going to keep trying?" Morrison asked, setting a cup of coffee on the table beside Rachel's chair. Rachel nodded without hesitation. He carried that intel through hell. Someone should remember. Morrison looked at the still form in the bed, then back at Rachel. "For what it's worth, Captain, what you did back in Raleigh, standing up to Mercer even when it cost you, that took more guts than anything I saw downrange." Rachel looked at the coffee, the steam rising in pale ribbons, the warmth of something human in a room designed for medicine and time. She said quietly, as much to herself as to Morrison, "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." She returned to her charting, the patch now preserved in its evidence locker, the colonel still breathing, still waiting, still holding whatever memories remained from those mountains where everything changed. If you found yourself caught between 2 worlds, one visible and one hidden, would you speak up, or would you stay silent? Let me know in the comments. And if you think Rachel should have done something different, I want to hear it. Please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story about heroes nobody's looking for.